that put their questions in the question box. You can, if they're relevant questions, you can just come on right away and tell me the question.
Right, Mr. Edgar, I'll do that, sir.
Okay, great. Are we ready to start or not yet? Anyway, good morning, everybody. I think we're just waiting a few minutes before we get things rolling. Are we getting ready?
Mr. Edgar, I think probably majority of them have already joined, so it's already 225 on board.
Okay.
We are good to go.
Okay, let's go. Good morning, everybody. I hope, so if everyone's there, you can wave. I can't hear you, but I can see you wave. Let's see everyone waving. Come on, waving. There you go. Thank you. I can tell that. So I know there's a real person, and you didn't put a photo of yourself in front of the camera, so it just looks like you're there. So anyway, greetings from Denver, Colorado. It's evening here, but I know it's morning for you. So today, I know you had an introductory with Peter on Friday, and I think he went through basically what we're going to be going through over the next 2 to 3 weeks. I thought we would start your first official presentation in the vineyard, because wine is basically a product that is created in the vineyard, and what happens in the vineyard will really affect how the final product is going to taste. So we're going to do that. So we're going to do, 1 second. I just have to reset. 1 second. So as I said, the grapes are grown in the vineyard. And as you know, that wine is made all over the world, but not all wine tastes the same. So what we're going to learn today is the effects of the grapes in the vineyard and how that dictates how the final product of the wine is going to be for us. We're actually going to be tasting, I'm going to be tasting, but we're going to talk about 2 different wines. One is this is a Puy Montrachet from Burgundy in France, and then this is a Merivale Chardonnay from Napa Valley. And they are all made from Chardonnay, but the look of the wine, the smell of the wine, the taste of the wine is going to be slightly different, because the grapes that were grown for these wines came from different countries, different vineyards, and different areas of terroir, which is a word that we're going to learn about. 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so before we get into the vineyard, I just want to talk a little bit about the basics of what wine is, because once we understand the basic of wine, then we can better understand the effect of what's going on in the vineyard. So wine, as you know, is a drink that is made from the fermented juice of freshly picked grapes. And then fermentation is a natural process where yeast is basically eating the molecules of sugar and converting them into alcohol, CO2, and heat. This is our little equation. S is for sugar, yeast gives us alcohol, carbon dioxide, and it actually creates a little bit of heat. But where does this S come from? So the sugar that is produced in the grapes, this is, because without the sugar, we can't do our fermentation and we can't get alcohol, we can't create wine. So a lot of people think that the sugar is actually created in the grapes itself, which is not true. The grapes are actually just a storage tank for the sugar. So the sugar is produced in the plant in the leaf. So all the leaves that are on the plant, this is where all the magic happens. And it's with these, if you can remember from your high school biology and chemistry, this is caused by photosynthesis. You have the leaf, which is on the grapevine, and it gets hit by the sunlight, because basically all wine is sunlight in a glass. So the sun hits the leaves, in reacting with the chlorophyll, it creates sugar. So the sugar is created in the leaf, and then it's transferred through the vines, and it's stored into the grapes. Okay, so it's very important that these leaves, this is where it's all done. And a grape basically is about 80% water. And when it's fully ripe, we get 20% sugars. And then we get 1% something called PC. PC stands for phenolic compound. And without getting too complicated on it, I just want you to know that the PC is basically all of the things that makes grapes taste like grapes. And then those flavors are then transferred into the wine. So then our wine tastes the way it tastes because of the way the grapes are produced. So these phenolic compounds are slightly different depending on where the grapes are growing. And that's what we're going to get into today. Hold on. My computer's having fun. So the phenolic compounds, if we talk about that a little bit more, if you think about a mango also has water, it also has sugar, and it has its own set of phenolic compounds. But the phenolic compounds that are in mangoes are the things that make mangoes taste like mangoes. Grapes have their own unique set of phenolic compounds. And that's what makes grapes taste like grapes. And then again, when we take this grape juice, we ferment it, we're going to end up with our wine and the flavors that have the wine. 1 second. Well, my PowerPoint comes back online. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the foundation of all wine, and that is that the grapes are grown in the vineyard, and the wine is basically created there. Because if we don't have quality grapes being produced, we're not going to have a quality wine. So the science or the process of growing grapes and studying grapes is called viticulture. So viticulture is the scientific study of grapes. It focuses on the growth and the production of the grapes, and we're going to learn about that, what affects the grapes in the vineyard. When the grapes are being used specifically for wine production, the study of grapes can also be called viniculture. So viticulture and viniculture are somewhat related, but in this process, when we talk about viticulture, we're going to talk about growing grapes in the vineyard. Viniculture is going to be more about the production of wine. And Peter's going to do a session on wine production for you in the next couple of days. These both fall under horticulture, which is basically all plants. But it is important to understand, very, very important, and I've said it already, that great wine is made in the vineyard. If we don't produce a quality grape, there's no way we can produce a quality wine. The two are irreparably tied together. You certainly can make bad wine from good grapes, but let's hope that if they're going through all of the energy to make these great grapes, they will also take care of the winery to be able to make great wine. So let's remember that. Let's think about first where grapes grow, because as we said today, we're going to be talking about two different Chardonnays coming from two different areas in the world, and they're going to be different wines, but made from the same grape. So let's look at where we can find grapes growing, and that is typically between 30 degrees and 50 degrees latitude. If we look in the upper northern hemisphere, we've got the United States, we've got all of Europe, areas of China, all in there. And if we look in our southern hemisphere between 30 and 50 degrees, we've got Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So all of those wine producing areas typically fall within those bands. We do get wine production outside of these bands, and we're going to talk about how we can grow grapes in these other areas. But what's nice about between 30 and 50 is there's just a significant amount of sunshine that is happening throughout the growing period. And again, if we don't have the sunlight, we don't have our photosynthesis in the leaf, we're not making the sugar, we're not ripening our grapes. Also, there is a certain amount of heat that is created, because grapes, for them to grow and to produce the vines to produce the grapes, they need to have a certain amount of warmth. And they get that in the summertime between 30 and 50, pretty much easily. If you notice, India is a little bit out of that range, but we'll talk about why we are still able to produce wine in India. Because again, in between 30 and 50, it's quite easy to grow grapes there, because we do have these significant amount of sunlight, we have the amount of temperature, but in other areas, for example, if you see anything closer to the equator, one of the reasons we can't really produce quality grapes as well there is because it's too hot. See, grapes like heat, they like warmth, but they don't like excessive heat. If they get excessive heat, the vine actually gets a little bit scared and it thinks it's going to die. So it actually stops all of that photosynthesis, all of that production, and it just closes down and it just tries to survive. So in the areas where there's too much heat, you're not going to see quality grapes growing. We can certainly grow grapes there, but we just don't have the quality of the grape that we do in these 30 to 50 latitude bands in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. So all of the things that affect grapes, we sort of put them into a basket, and we call this basket terroir, and it's Terroir. And terroir there's 4 aspects of terroir that we have to make that affect our grapes in the vineyard. The first aspect of terroir is climate. And again, we talked about the grapes need a certain amount of sunlight. They need a certain amount of warmth. They need a certain amount of moisture. We have soil. Soil is really important for growing grapes. And grapes are kind of funny. They actually don't like very fertile soil. They actually like soil that isn't so fertile. So that really black, rich soil that we get for growing tomatoes and vegetables, this is not the soil that we want to have for grapes. If the soil is too fertile, the grapes will grow too fast, and we tend to get lots and lots of leaves and stalks and stems and that, but the grapes themselves actually don't work as well with that. So let's start first with again, we've got climate, and under climate we've got cold, hot, windy, foggy, terrain, north, south facing slopes, elevation and altitude, soil, we have types of soil, mineral deposits, and then we have the density. Is it a really tight soil or is it a very loose soil? Soil is important because grapes, they need a certain amount of water for photosynthesis, but they actually don't like too much water. My sommelier teacher, he had an expression, he said, grapes don't like wet feet. So they just need a little bit of water, not very much, just enough to be able to do photosynthesis. And then we have tradition, which is technique, and then the winemaker. But let's look a little bit at climate. So climate is the single most important factor in shaping the grape's flavors and its characteristics. Grapes require about 1,300 to 1,500 hours of sunlight while they're growing, and they round 27 inches of rainfall. But most of that rain we want to have in the spring and in the winter months. So in winter and spring months, it can rain, but we don't want to have rain when the grapes are being built, when the grapes themselves are growing on the vine. It's very important that during that time, we want the vineyards to be as dry as possible. And you always hear that when it's getting close to harvest, they're saying, oh, the rains never came, the rains haven't come, which is good. But if the rains come, that's not good for the grapes, because the vines are actually very good at sucking up water. And what happens is, if we've got, as we discussed, you know, the perfect grape when it's ripe is 80% water, 20% sugars, and a 1% of these flavors that make the grapes taste like grapes. If we're almost at harvest and we've got these really nice high concentrations of sugar, we have these high concentrations of the phenol compounds, all these nice flavors, and it rains, the grapes vines will actually suck up that water into these grapes and start to dilute the sugar and to dilute the flavors. So we really, for the perfect grape, no rains during the final growing season, and also definitely not before harvest. We don't want to dilute that concentrations of flavors. And depending on the climate, our viticulturists will make adjustments to keep light and water within the right range. For example, in certain countries, if it's very, very dry, we can irrigate. These are sort of things that we like to do. But climate is very important. And the more in climate, the hotter it is, the more sunlight that the grapes will get, they're actually going to produce more sugar. And this sugar translates into more alcohol. So hot climate, warm climate countries, for example, like California, this wine has about 14.5% alcohol. The Burgundy from France has 13.5% alcohol. So there's a 1% difference, which doesn't seem like a lot, but as a percentage, it's quite a bit different. And that affects how the wine tastes and how the wine feels in the mouth by the alcohol. And also in a hotter climate or a warmer climate, the grapes just get the phenolic compounds that a grape gets in a warmer climate is going to give more riper, richer fruit flavors to the wine. For example, in Chardonnay, the Montrachet is going to have more lemons and pear in its flavors, where the hot climate, the Chardonnay from California, from Napa, is going to have more almost pineapple and some mango flavors. So this higher temperature in the vineyard is just going to make the grapes taste riper. Again, we're going to have a higher alcohol content. So that's why climate is really such an important factor when it comes to how the wine is going to be different. So climate is one important aspect. Terrain is another. Terrain and altitude of the vineyard. For example, how high up in altitude is the vineyard is one of the most important focuses for quality now. And if we looked at that 30 to 50 degree band in the northern and southern hemispheres, if you are growing grapes closer to the equator where it's hotter, typically these grapes are being grown in high elevation areas, because as the elevation goes up, the temperature is cooler. For example, if we think about Rajasthan in May, it's really, really hot. May, June, really, really hot. But if we were to go to Darjeeling, which is still in India, about the same latitude, but because Darjeeling is so high in altitude, it's actually a lot cooler. So we can grow grapes, quality grapes, in areas where we have higher elevation. For example, in Australia, which is a really hot climate, and Australia is in the 30 to 50 in the northern hemisphere, or southern hemisphere, but it's still quite warm. But the quality grapes in Australia are grown along the coast, because when we get to our next slide, we're going to talk about other influences there by ocean, which will cool it down. But also in Australia, as you go inland in Australia, where it can get very, very hot, you will see quality wines being grown in vineyards that have much higher elevations. So as you start to go up the hills and the mountains in Australia, the elevation comes up, but also the climate is a little more moderate. It's not so hot. So that's why elevation is really, really important. Slopes and hills are the preferred places for grapes. Remember I said that so many teachers said grapes don't like wet feet. So if we're growing our grapes on a slope and it rains, what happens to the rain? Does it stay on a slope? No, it runs away. It goes down. So slopes are very, very good for drainage. Slopes are also very good, especially if we're in the northern hemisphere. And in Burgundy, it's actually quite cool in Burgundy. And it's quite far north, so it doesn't get as much days of sunshine as, say, the southern part of France. But if you go to these cooler areas in France, more north, you'll find almost all of the grapes are being grown on the south-facing slope, because the south-facing slope is getting this direct sunlight. A north-facing slope is not getting any of the morning sun. So a north-facing slope, you're never going to see any grapes grown in a cool area, for example, in Burgundy. But a south-facing slope gets maximum sunlight. And again, that sunlight is the magic, and that's what gives us the photosynthesis, ripens our grapes, creates the sugar in the grape, and allows us to have the wine. So again, slopes are valued for their exposure to the sunlight and their ability to drain easily. South-facing slopes are preferable in the northern hemisphere because they're getting more hours of sunlight. And in the southern hemisphere, it's the reverse. Then we want north-facing slopes in the southern hemisphere to maximize our sunlight. Again, mountains, that's part of terrain that's really important. Hot areas, hot climate countries, elevation, higher we up we go. That's why we're seeing actually a lot of growth production in India, in Nasik. Nasik's actually quite high up elevation. It's a little bit cooler there. And then valleys are great because they naturally give us these slopes. They naturally give us these slopes. And again, the south-facing slope, north-facing slope. And large bodies of water. If any of you were watching the interview with Donald Zeraldo about growing grapes in Niagara, he talked about the Great Lakes that are there and how the Great Lakes moderate the climate. And if you could imagine, if we're in northern France, where it's quite cool, the hours of sunlight are less, we're definitely wanting to have that north-facing slope. But if you can imagine the north-facing slope with a big lake in front of it, and not only is the sunlight coming into the vineyard, it's also hitting the lake, and then that sunlight is bouncing into the vineyard. So you're getting the reflection from the lake, putting the sun rays into the vineyard. So they're getting it directly, and they're also getting it as a reflection from the lake. So that is another way. So it's basically acting like a mirror, because the more sunlight we can give into these leaves, what's going to happen? More photosynthesis. More photosynthesis, raising the levels of sugar. And also at the same time, it doesn't just raise the levels of the sugar, it also raises the percentage of these phenolic compounds, the flavors and aromas that we're getting in our grapes, we're getting in our wine. Soil. Soil is another aspect of terroir that helps the grapes to produce quality wine. And maintaining the quality of the soil is very important in vineyard management. You want the soil to be healthy. You want the soil to be aerated. You want it to be light, and you want the oxygen to be able to get in there. It should be loose. It shouldn't be hard packed soil, because hard packed soil is not a healthy. It doesn't allow the vines to really have a good existence. And if we have really bad soil, then the fruit doesn't have enough nutrient. But again, we don't want the soil that's too rich, too fertile, because then the plant, as I said, is just going to grow lots of vines and leaves. It's not going to focus. The grapevine is actually kind of funny. It actually likes to struggle. It likes to struggle for water. That's why they have these amazing root systems that can go down 100, 200 feet to find the water that's there and to find all the nutrient. The harder that the grape has to struggle to get water, the harder that the vine has to struggle to get nutrient, it produces a better quality grape. And again, a better quality grape gives us a better quality wine. So they're kind of a funny plant. They're kind of a funny plant. Content of the soil, density of the soil. If that soil is really packed, and let's say it's like a really rough clay, or that black soil that we use for tomatoes, if it rains, these soils then absorb all this water and they keep it there. And again, grapes don't like too much water. So the grapes actually prefer soil that's maybe a little looser, like sand, gravel, because if the rain comes and it's the gravel, what happens to it? Does it stay there? No, it's going to go right through. It's going to continue down into the soil all the way down. So it gets away from the vine. So loose soil, gravel, sand is preferred. And then also the kind of soil. So let's go back to northern France. We've got a problem there. Again, we don't have a lot of sunlight. So we really have to maximize this sunlight. And if we look at one of the more northern wine growing regions in France, is the very famous region of Champagne. And in Champagne, all of the quality grapes are always grown on south-facing slopes. Very little in the valley, nothing on the north-facing slopes. It's a south-facing slope, that's it. If it's on a river or by a river, which is great because again, the sunlight is bouncing there. But one of the interesting things about the Champagne region is champ actually is French for chalk. So the soil in Champagne is actually this chalky, white colored soil. So when sunlight hits a black soil, what happens to it? It just gets immediately absorbed into the soil. That's it. But if sunlight hits a white surface, it actually reflects back from this. So this chalky colored soil, when the sunlight hits it, and you've got your vineyard on these chalky colored soil, the light goes into the canopy of the vine, the spaces in between where you have this white chalky colored, the sunlight hits there, and then it bounces back into the vines. So a light colored soil will reflect. White stones will do the same thing as well. And again, if you've got that big lake, it's also reflecting the sunlight. So whenever we're in an area where we have limited sunlight, which typically is regions that are more north in the northern hemisphere or more south in the southern hemisphere, like New Zealand, we want to have these additional benefits in the vineyard in order to be able to allow our grapes to get ripe, allow them to build up the sugar content, build up the phenol compounds, all of these things. So content of the soil, very, very, very important. Now let's talk about tradition. And tradition is really a key component of how, and again, tradition is part of that terroir. So it's the tradition of making wine in that particular region. And we see tradition more coming from the old world, where they've been making wine for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So even though tradition is a human interaction, ancient winemaking tends to be highly dependent on the region's climate, soil, and terrain. And the reason why they make wine and grow grapes in a particular way in, say, Tuscany in Italy, is because they've been experiencing the effects of the different terroir of these vineyards. And they understand that they need to grow a particular kind of grape there because that's what the terroir, the climate allows. So this is a really important part of tradition. So for example, in Burgundy, especially in Montrachet, but everywhere in Burgundy, typically the only white grape produced there is Chardonnay. And they've been growing Chardonnay there for a few hundred years because they probably had many, many different kinds of grapes growing there. And they were just, as they were growing the grapes, they were making the wine from the different grapes. And they just found that the Chardonnay produced a better wine because the Chardonnay in that particular region loves the amount of sunlight that it gets there. Chardonnay in that area loves the kind of soil that's there. It just produces the best quality grape. So that's why where we have this tradition, it's because it's not that someone decided this is what we're going to do. It's just with trial and error and practice, they were able to figure out that Chardonnay was really a great grape to grow there because the quality of the wine that came from it was something that really suited that. Okay, so so if we go back and we just sort of discuss those four components of terroir: cold, hot, windy, foggy. Wind is a very important part of a healthy vineyard as well. One of the biggest problems that vines have is too much humidity. And humidity causes mold, causes rot. So if you've got a vineyard and it gets a nice breeze that runs through it, and again, vineyards by the ocean, because there's always breezes coming off the ocean, or vineyards on a lake, there's always the wind that's coming in off the lake. The wind comes through and keeps the vines healthy, keeps them fresh, and it keeps, if there is, for example, a rain that comes and it creates this humidity, the wind will come in and dry it out. So wind is really an important part of just keeping the vines healthy. So it's a really, really important part of it. Fog is also very important. For example, this Napa Valley Chardonnay. The Napa Valley produces some of the best Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon in the world. But where it's located, it gets quite hot in the summertime. And again, grapes don't like too much heat. Too much heat, they actually ripen too fast. You get lots and lots of sugar being created, but you're not getting the phenolic compounds created at the same level. So you just don't have the same quality of grapes. But in Napa, they have the fog. And if you ever get a chance to go to San Francisco, or if any of you have ever been to San Francisco, I don't think so. There's this amazing thing, because at nighttime, I remember driving back from Napa Valley towards San Francisco. And as we were leaving Napa Valley and we were heading on the freeway to San Francisco, you could see the hills, the mountains in front of us. And there was this huge fog, billows of clouds that were coming over the hill and coming up into the valley. And this happens almost every night. And what happens is this fog comes in and it covers over the vineyards. And in the morning when the sun rises and it starts to heat up the area, this fog is acting as this insulative protection from too much, allowing the vineyard to get too hot. So it actually stays throughout most of the morning till about 11 o'clock, and then it slowly starts to burn off. And then the vineyard starts to heat up. And in the afternoon, it gets really nice and warm, but not too hot, because it had that little blanket of protection for those first few hours in the morning. So this fog is very kind of special for that area. And if this area didn't have this fog coming in, they would not produce the same quality of grapes and quality of wine, because the grapes would have gotten too hot. So that's why fog is such an important aspect in certain places. In areas that are already too humid, maybe you wouldn't want that. You don't want. So it just, if it's in the right place, then it's quite effective. Again, north and south facing, can't tell you how important that is. It maximizes the sunlight in those northern hemisphere, northern parts of the North Hemisphere. In areas where it's too hot, countries that are too hot, we have to either go close to the ocean to get the breezes from the ocean. For example, another country that benefits from that is South Africa, because South Africa is quite a hot country, but they produce some really good quality grapes, but these are all around the coast at the bottom part of South Africa, because the ocean down there, the Antarctic Ocean, is actually quite cool. So the breezes that are coming in off of this ocean really cool that area down to get to that sort of perfect temperature that grapes like. If you go further inland in South Africa, it's too hot. They do produce a lot of wine further in, but the quality of this wine is much, much less. The quality is much less. So hot areas, we want to have the cooling breezes from the ocean. Or Australia, the same thing as well. Coastal vineyards in Australia produce quality. Or as you go further inland, you start to get higher in elevation up the mountains, then they can start producing grapes, wine that is of much better quality. Rocks, mineral deposits, remember, not too much fertility in the soil. Lots of stones, granite, schist, sand, gravel, clay. These are all very low nutrient soils, but they really add a lot to the quality of the wines. And again, the density, loose soil, gravel, sand is great for drainage, so the water stays away from the vines. And again, that's chalky, light-colored soil, white stones is reflecting the sunlight as it comes into the vineyard. Again, we want to maximize the sunlight that goes into the grapes, because again, sunlight for the leaves, photosynthesis, sugar, ripening grapes, all of that stuff. And again, tradition, technique, what the winemaker does to be able to then translate those grapes. And also the winemaker, he's choosing what grapes he's planting. For example, Sauvignon Blanc is a grape that likes cool climate. It likes to have warm days, but very cool nights. So you would never grow this grape in areas that are very, very hot. For example, in the Central Valley of California, which is very, very hot, Sauvignon Blanc doesn't produce well. Where Cabernet Sauvignon, Shiraz, Syrah, it likes heat. It actually produces a better quality. So different grapes are in different regions for a reason. For example, in Bordeaux, we get Cabernet Sauvignon because it's a little warmer there. It's a little hotter there. In Burgundy, they do Pinot Noir, and Pinot Noir likes it cooler. There's no Cabernet being grown in Burgundy. There's no Pinot Noir being grown in Bordeaux. Pinot Noir likes it cool. Burgundy's cooler. Cabernet Sauvignon likes it warmer. Bordeaux is warmer down there. So that's a little bit about tradition. And again, in Bordeaux, they have the same thing they had in Burgundy. They've been growing, you know, hundreds of different kinds of grapes over the last centuries, and they just found the ones that actually work the best. So that's why we have that. Okay, so now let's do a little bit more direct comparison on these two wines, the Chardonnay from California and the Chardonnay from Burgundy in France. As you see here in Burgundy, and if we were to look at Burgundy on the map in France, it's quite far north, so it's significantly cooler there. Here is Montrachet. This is it, Pouilly Montrachet. Montrachet is here. It's actually a little bit warmer than it is in Chablis. Chablis would be even cooler and also only produces Chardonnay, but the Chardonnay in Chablis is actually significantly different in taste than the one in Montrachet and the one in California. If we look at the band here, this is at the bottom. This is very close to 30 degrees, and this is where Napa is. If we look at Burgundy, it's really close to 50 degrees. So there's probably about an 18-degree difference between the grapes that are grown in Burgundy and the grapes that are grown in Napa in California. So we're going to have a much riper tasting wine here. Again, pineapple, mango flavors. Cooler in Montrachet, we're going to be getting more apple, pear, lime, lemon flavors. It's just because it's cooler. So we're not going to have that intensity of ripeness that we're going to get in a warmer climate. But this particular Napa Chardonnay is going to be tasting a little bit different than one that would have been grown more in the central coast of California, where it gets super hot. Again, the quality in Napa is very, very good because it has the heat, but it's not too hot. But they're just different kinds of wines. You're going to get much more minerality in this from Burgundy because there's a lot more minerality in the soil there. And if we look at Napa, you can see here it's in California. And it's right in here. But it is inland, so we're not getting the cooling breezes from San Francisco, because if you ever go to San Francisco, it's quite cool. But by the time you get into here, it's quite hot, quite warm. But it's this fog that it gets into the Napa Valley that gives that a little bit of protection from that very extreme heat that it gets there. So, and you will even see, I've only got this is the California. And if you notice, there's a little bit of golden color to the wine. I didn't open the Montrachet yet because I've only got one bottle left and it's a special wine, but it would be actually much paler in color. So you can actually, when you look at two wines side by side, you'll be able to see a warmer climate wine because the color will be more yellow, more golden. A cooler climate wine is going to be more pale, more lemon, almost greenish tinge in color by that. So that's why the effect of what happens in the vineyard can really affect not just the flavors of the wine, but actually how you perceive it, how you see it in the color as well. So these are sort of the aspects of terroir that will make a difference in the, not just the flavors of the wine, the aromas in the wine, but also the color. And I'm not saying that a cool or a warm climate wine is better or worse than a cool climate wine. They're just different. They're different in style. And it just comes down to personal taste, because some people prefer sort of maybe something that's not so ripe, not so intense in flavor, more elegance, more minerality is what we're getting in the Montrachet. Where some people like to have that sort of really full flavored Chardonnay, those riper flavors that you get in wine. So it's just a matter of personal preference, but they're definitely different, but it's the same grape, still Chardonnay. And again, we can look at examples in all sorts of different grape varieties as well. Merlot, Cabernet, Syrah, they just look, taste, smell different. Hot climate versus cool climate. So that's kind of where we're at. So if we can, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover today as far as terroir, viticulture, all of those aspects. So if there's any questions that anyone has, maybe we can take some questions.
Yes, Mr. Edgar, I think probably some of these students have interacted with me, and I have put forward a couple of questions over here pertaining to today's topic, sir.
Okay.
So one question was asked by one of our students. It says that, what exactly is the phenolic compound and what is its role in the grape growing process?
Okay, well, the phenolic compound is everything. Because again, phenolic compound translates to things that make grapes taste like grapes. And grapes are fermented and become wine. And if we didn't have, if you've got a very thin grape, or a grape that's not really perfectly ripe, it doesn't have high levels of sugar, and it also doesn't have high levels of things that make grapes taste like grapes. So that wine is going to taste rather thin and uninteresting. But if a grape is allowed to get perfectly ripe, it's got lots of sunlight, lots of warmth, all of the things that it needs, then the phenolic compounds will be more interesting. It's just like if you can think about mango season, you go to the market and mangoes are just starting to come into the market, and you buy some and you know they're not quite ripe, but you haven't had a mango in so long, you wanted to get one. So you get it, you go home, you cut it, you put it in your mouth and you eat it. It's not that interesting, is it? Because it's not fully ripe. It doesn't have the levels of sugar, but it also doesn't have the levels of the things that make mangoes taste like mangoes. Grapes are the same way. If it's perfectly ripe and it has high levels of the phenolic compounds or all of the complex flavors of grapes, that now translates into a very interesting, delicious tasting wine. Okay, and again, they kind of come together. As the grape ripens, sugar levels rise and the phenolic compounds rise. If it's, grapes actually like to ripen slow and steady. So that's why nice warm temperatures is great. But if it gets too hot, the sugars will ripen first, and we don't get the phenolic compounds coming up as much. So we get really a high alcohol wine, because high sugar equates to high alcohol, but kind of an uninteresting wine because it doesn't have the complex flavors of the grapes. So that's why it's important to have both of them. So slow and steady gives us alcohol or sugar levels and phenolics, which makes a better wine. Okay, another question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Edgar. I think probably this must have answered all the queries. And the next question we move forward to, it says, when we prune the grapevine, does it have an effect on the sugar content of the grapes during the pruning stage?
Yes, absolutely. And again, if when we prune the vines, we're also sort of shaping them or in order to sort of maximize the sun exposure. Because for example, if we let our vines get kind of overcrowded like this, then they act as a little bit of an umbrella. So even though there's sun that's happening on the top of the vines, all of those grapes that are underneath aren't getting any sunlight. So that's why we want to trim the top ones so that we sort of have these nice long panels of grapes, of leaves that can get that sunlight. So that's why it's very, very important. But for example, if it's a really hot climate, they actually like the grapes to add that little protection because it keeps the vines a little bit cooler. So in a hot climate, maybe we want to have a canopy to sort of protect the grapes from, because again, if the grapes themselves get too much direct sunlight, it can damage them. So that's why it's important to have that. So yeah, so pruning is important and it does
Right.
affect.
Right. Okay. So we move to next question. It says, how the grapes inherit or exhibit the flavor components like green apples, pears, and where these different fruit components arise in the grape.
Okay, and again, it depends on the grape variety, but each grape variety has its own flavor profile. For example, Sauvignon Blanc can have fresh cut grass, grapefruit. Chardonnay can have, um, again, tropical flavors if it's hot climate, pineapple, mango. Gewürztraminer is a grape that has the aromas and flavors of lychee. Riesling grape has lime and almost a kerosene, a gasoline kind of aroma. These are all specific to the grape varieties. And it's not that we're squeezing mangoes into a hot climate Chardonnay. It's just particular grapes grown in particular climates have a characteristic similar to these things. So that's just the way they are. But yeah, different grape varieties are going to have different flavor profiles. It's just like, do all mangoes taste the same? No. Do they smell the same? Look the same? Color the same? No. They're slightly different because there's lots of different kinds of mangoes. So equate that. I always like to equate grapes and mangoes because I know you understand mangoes very well. Being in India, that's my favorite thing about being in India was all the mangoes. But grapes are similar. Different varieties are going to give you different flavors, aromas, colors, shapes, everything. Another question?
Yeah. We move to the last question of the day, I guess. Probably that is, it says, what about the flavor of those wines produced in cold climate and also where you have a windy influence? And how does that influence in the wine production, the windy aspect?
Well, the windy aspect will influence quality of the vine by keeping the vines healthy. Again, a nice breeze coming through gets rid of the humidity and keeps the vines healthy. So you want to have a breeze. Breezes are really, if you don't have breeze and you have humidity, then you have a big problem with rot and mold and these issues. So wind will keep the vineyards healthier. And it also keeps a lot of diseases from happening. It just freshens the vineyard. It's just like when it's very humid in Kolkata or in India in general. In the morning when you wake up, you open all the windows to the house, right? You open all the windows and you let the breeze come through the house because it keeps the mold and the mildew and the damp out of the house so you don't get it growing there. So the vineyards are the same way. They like the breeze, it freshens things out, it reduces the humidity. Reduced humidity will keep the vines healthier.
Right. So we finally come into the last question pertaining to this climatic aspect, Mr. Edgar. One of the students would love to know about what is about the minstrel effect, which really influences heavily on the Rhone Valley vineyards.
Yeah, well, the Mistral is a big cold wind. We were there. We experienced it firsthand, and it was cold, and it was very, very strong. It was just like very, very strong. But again, it's that same aspect. It just keeps the vineyard healthy, gets rid of humidity. Yeah, it's just about the health of the vineyard. But it's very extreme. And again, it can get quite hot, especially in the southern part of the Rhone. Can get very, very, very hot down there. So by having that cool breeze coming through, it helps to sort of moderate that temperature. Again, it's all about finding that perfect temperature band. Not too hot, not too cool, just right. And all of the different effects of terroir will help to do that by mitigating heat or maximizing sunlight, depending on where the vineyard is in the country.
Right, Mr. Edgar. So that's all for today's, as far as today's questions are concerned from our students. I'm sure they must have a fantastic and enlightening session. And it looks like a wonderful story that they're hearing on a Monday morning, with regards to the climate and the terroir and the geography of wine. So it is so good to hear. And like that, you have really given us a very fantastic example of seasonal mangoes. They are all diverse in nature.
They are.
So it's good to hear. Right. So I think probably, I don't find any further questions coming up, Mr. Edgar.
Okay. I think we're out of time too, so we're good.
Right.
Okay. Namaskar, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Edgar. Thank you, Mr. Edgar, for really, taking this important time within this pandemic era. And we would have really been happier to see you live in class. But nevertheless, we'll wait for the time to blossom once again. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, students. Thank you, sir.